Welcome to Tales from the Fireside by RODEAX and Dan Lee, a collection of grim tales to light your way through the long dark of winter.
I wondered if you would be joining us tonight. Well, don't just stand there. Close the door, shut out the bitter cold. Come, sit, for the story is just about to begin.
The small hours were the worst, when she would lay awake watching the daybreak, judging it by the light that filtered through the thinnest curtains in existence. The blanket was thin too, and the mattress, and no matter how she tossed and turned and tried to get comfortable, somehow it was still too cold, because it wasn't her bed, and it wasn't her room, and it wasn't even her house. But her stuff was here, and she had nowhere else to go. It had been 2 days since Thea had moved back in with her mother, and since she had flown the nest several years previous, somehow the house had grown cold and unwelcoming. The only remnants of the house's old charm had been stuffed into drawers in the spare bedroom. Her childhood toys, her grandmother's crucifix, even the bedtime stories her brother had written. No longer was it the charming family home of her youth, where she and her brother would play on the carpet before the hearth, or awake on Christmas morning to a familiar sense of magic. The house had been gutted to make way for new flooring, new furniture, and an entirely new personality. It was as if the house's very soul had been ripped out with the carpet. It filled Thea with sadness to remember it as it was, while looking around at the stark and empty husk it had become. Of course, her mother called it modern, but she was biased. She was dating the man who designed it. Alistair Schmidt had moved in with Angela only 2 months prior to Thea's return, but in that time he had somehow managed to convince her mother to completely do away with the home that had evolved here and transform it into something stark and cold. Suffice to say that Thea had not warmed to him. She detested the way he skulked through the house, lingering in shadowed spaces like a mould creeping up the walls and manifesting on the ceiling. The way he would darken doorways and study you with those piercing eyes, examining you as if you were nothing more than a morsel in a petri dish. To Thea, Alistair Schmidt appeared stuffy, self-important, condescending, and above all, a creep. In short, he made her skin crawl. Thea sat up in bed, still wearing her pyjamas. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes, wondering dully how long it had been since she'd had a decent night's rest. Of course, she knew the answer. It was before Mark had left her. She sighed, recognizing her own futility of thought, and slowly got out of bed. Not so long ago, Thea and Mark had been in love. They had lived together for years, and under a borrowed roof they had made something of a home. But in any case, it was over now. Thea shuffled into her slippers and braced herself before leaving the spare bedroom. Her mother had just arrived home. "Morning, Thea," she chimed automatically. "Morning," Thea replied. Angela, her hospital lanyard still draped around her neck, was stirring a cup of chamomile tea into submission. "How was work?" asked Thea as she put the kettle back on. Angela replied by widening her eyes and puffing out breath, as if she had been saving it for her entire shift. "Understaffed as usual," she said as she made her way towards the bedroom. "Night," she called over her shoulder. "Morning," Thea called back. "Good morning, Thea," uttered Alistair in his usual rain-cloud tones. Thea started. She hadn't noticed him sitting there behind a newspaper in the corner. "Morning," she replied guardedly. Suddenly, breakfast required all of Thea's attention. "Still in your nightclothes at this time?" he mused, sending needles of discomfort into Thea's sides. "Yes," she replied. The toaster was taking far too long, and she had already gotten a plate and a knife out. There was only so much more dithering she could do before she'd have to meet his uncanny stare. Alistair tutted morosely. "You'll have to forget him sooner or later," he said. Thea flinched. Finally the toast popped, and Thea was able to hastily spread it with butter and gather her plate and mug into her hands. "Taking breakfast in your room?" asked Alistair, arching a narrow eyebrow. Thea finally met his gaze. She was all too aware of how pathetic she felt. Alistair looked piercingly into her, his face a mask of cruel derision. Thea glowered and said nothing. She took her breakfast into the spare room and ate alone in peace. When she had finished, she checked the time on her phone. She would have to go soon, so it was with a sombre resignation that she donned her work clothes and prepared to leave the house. She had intended to pass quickly through the kitchen, quietly leaving her breakfast things beside the sink so as not to alert the self-appointed warden. But of course it didn't work. The man's hearing was inhuman. Thea walked briskly into the kitchen and deposited her plate, not in any mind to stop. But Alistair was too quick. "Thea?" he purred like thunder, standing behind her in the doorway. She sighed and turned to face him. "Yes, Alistair," she said, but as she turned, her breath caught in her throat, for he was not standing in the doorway at all. Instead, he was standing not a foot behind her. She stepped back into the worktop and clutched it uncomfortably. "I wouldn't worry about that boy of yours," Alistair crooned. Thea hated it when he crooned. It was a sound like nails on a chalkboard. It made her skin crawl. "A young woman like yourself has no need of a boy," he continued. "A young woman like you needs a man." Thea was repulsed. Alistair's skin had a sallow sheen to it that was all too visible as he stood far too close. And still his eyes pierced hers. Thea said nothing and quickly breezed past the man and out of the front door. Alistair remained, smiling grotesquely after her, haunting her mother's soulless kitchen. It took Thea the entire journey to steady her throbbing heart. The day was long, and the bookshop where Thea worked was full of irritating customers who clearly had no grasp of the Dewey Decimal System. But the bus journey home brought no solace. It was 6 o'clock. Angela would be leaving soon for another long shift at the hospital. It was the only chance Thea would have to speak to her mother. She wrote and rewrote the text several times, but eventually settled for simplicity. "Hi, Mum. I want to talk to you about Alistair. He's been making some very inappropriate comments at me, and I don't trust him." Send. Minutes later came Angela's response. "You just need to give him time. You'll like him when you get to know him. I hope work was okay." Thea sighed. And upon reaching home, the torture continued. Angela had already left for work, leaving the house with a quiet sense of foreboding. The rooms were darkened, and as Thea stepped through the door, she wondered if perhaps Alistair had gone out. Empty houses always have a stillness to them, a quietly untouched quality that one can feel permeating through the air as they open the door and step inside. Relief tumbled through Thea's chest, and for a moment she dropped her guarded and stony guise, letting her shoulders slump and her face soften. "Good evening, Thea," uttered Alistair from the darkness. Thea drew breath, and her shoulders retensed. "Hello," she said. She reached for the light switch, and after a moment's fumbling, the halogen glow swelled into the gaps around them. Alistair stood before her, and just for a moment, no more than one crazy instant, Thea could see Alistair's face contort, as if the very light repulsed him. His features creased into a snarl, his brow heavy, sagging in molten folds, and somehow his eyes were darker. Then he straightened his stance, and settled his gaze soberly on Thea, as if nothing was amiss at all. "Your mother has left me with instructions," said Alistair, his voice tolling like funeral bells. Thea raised her eyebrows and shut the door behind her. "This evening I am to bond with you," he said. "What would you like to do?" Thea was horrified. Not only had her mother blatantly ignored her misgivings, but she had actively salted her daughter's wounds. Thea tried to shake Alistair off, claiming that she was tired. She just wanted to watch a film by herself and go to bed. But of course, Alistair's rabid persistence never waned, and eventually Thea agreed that they would order a pizza and watch a film together. At least this way she wouldn't have to talk to the man. When the house was still a home, the pizza menu had lived on the fridge, secured by a colourful magnet. Now the kitchen's stark lines and angles harboured no colour at all, let alone a raggedy flyer that had been stuffed through the letterbox years ago. No matter. Thea knew her go-to order by heart. "Do you know what you want?" asked Thea. "Something rare and bloody," replied Alistair, drawing his lips back from his teeth into a primal grin. "Okay," replied Thea slowly. "I don't think you can get rare meat on a pizza, but I can ask. Garlic bread?" The dour man wrinkled his nose, causing it to furrow like that of a wild animal. "No," he replied sternly. "I find the smell detestable." "Fine," said Thea, and dialed the number. She located the television and wrestled with the remote. When Alistair had redecorated, he had obviously installed a more elegant system. "What films do you like?" asked Thea reluctantly. "Old films," purred Alistair again in that chalkboard tone, setting Thea's teeth on edge. "I find modern cinema lacking in culture." "I think it's supposed to be entertaining," argued Thea, quickly tiring of the man's stuffy attitude to everything. "Do you not appreciate culture, Thea?" he responded, his stare once more eating away at her insides. "Young women who appreciate culture are far more attractive than those who don't." Thea quickly selected some newly released horror B-movie, as deficient in culture as she could find. She had hoped to fall into a stupor and ignore present company completely, but as they ate and watched, Alistair would spout howls of laughter at every moment of tension or terror. Eventually, Thea retreated to the spare room, Alistair finally satisfied that they had bonded. She drifted willingly into the arms of sleep. Dark was the night, the air stringent with a dreary fog, and Thea walked alone. Though no street lamps marked the way, somehow an eerie half-light permeated and pooled on the cobblestones beneath her feet, and Thea could see that they were slicked with a layer of moisture. So were her clothes and her skin, letting the frost penetrate deeper, her breath a visible mist on the air. He was somewhere behind her. She could feel him, in the darkness, lurking always just out of sight. She quickened her pace. Of course, she did not know where she was going, but in the dream world one rarely does. The street was never-ending. No light, no buildings, only cobblestones and fog. She broke into a run, her shoes rapping on the slippery surface, and inevitably her footing faltered, and she tumbled to the ground. And then, out of the swirling darkness, came the man. Thea woke in a cold sweat, her mind reeling from the cryptic nightmare. Groggily she sat up, pushing away the covers, and caught her breath. The time on her phone read 3:49 a.m. Her mother would be home soon, and Alistair should be sleeping. Good. Thea made for the kitchen. She filled her glass from the designer faucet, frowning at the aerated water that came rushing out in frothing torrents. Obviously, Alistair was too good for ordinary tap water. "Have a bad dream?" he asked. Thea started, the glass clattering into the sink. "Don't you ever sleep?" she asked, spiking her voice with anger to mask the fear that fluttered in her chest. "Sleep is not for the wicked," smirked the man in the darkness. Thea hastily refilled her glass and turned to return to her sanctuary. "Why don't you stay a while?" crooned Alistair, and looking over her shoulder, Thea could swear that she caught a scarlet glint in those piercing eyes. Without reply, she walked briskly back to the spare room, shutting the door behind her. Perhaps she was crazy, or perhaps she was cautious, but no sooner had she shut out the darkness did she begin to rummage in the drawers. She remembered finding it when she'd first moved in, stuffed in a drawer along with stories and toys from childhood daydreams. There! Her grandmother's crucifix. It was true that they'd never liked it. She and her brother had found it foreboding, with its heavy pewter form and coldly etched detail. But tonight it bore only comfort. Thea clutched the crucifix close to her as she huddled in the thin blankets atop the lumpiest mattress in existence. The next day, Thea was up with the sunrise. Although Alistair was inevitably still lurking, Angela had just returned home, so Thea planned to sneak out quickly, bidding her mother an absent good morning on the way. No such luck. "Thea," called Angela, fighting back another yawn. "Could you do me a favour tonight?" "Sure, Mum, what is it?" responded Thea, struggling to hide the impatience in her voice. Alistair was lurking at the table, hiding behind the newspaper. "I have to go back to work in an hour, and I should be back by the evening. Can you make sure we have something in for dinner?" "Yeah," said Thea. "Haven't you just finished a shift?" Angela nodded, her movements filled with the weight one only feels when extremely unrested. "There's been some stock going missing from the blood banks," sighed Angela. "All of the staff are being interviewed." Thea was at a loss for words. Her eyes darted uncertainly to Alistair, who shuffled his broadsheet newspaper, never once showing his face. "It's absolute lunacy," said Angela, "but it is what it is." Thea nodded and bid her mother farewell. She caught the bus into town, the pewter crucifix forever digging into her side as it stowed away in hiding, tucked into the waistband of her jeans. However, instead of taking her usual route to the bookshop, Thea avoided it altogether. In fact, from the jostling safety of the bus, she phoned the shop, telling them that she was ill, en route to the pharmacy as they spoke. Being that she was a good shop worker, they bought her ruse with no question, and Thea was able to travel to the hardware store undisturbed. She had never bought garden stakes before. She hoped desperately that they still sold the wooden ones. The sun was just peaking in the centre of its arc by the time Thea caught the bus home, and a steady throng of lunch breakers were flowing through the streets. Her mother would be gone when she arrived at the house, which would make her task an awful lot easier. Thea resolved that if she was simply being insane, at least it might deter Alistair's uncomfortable advances. She realised that everyone on the bus was avoiding her, which suited her perfectly fine. Perhaps she would purchase garlic more often. The offensive bulbs jostled together in her tote bag alongside the wooden stakes. She made a mental note to stow all of them in her pockets before she arrived at the house. And so, as she mounted the steps and approached the front door, not only was the pewter crucifix still digging into her side, but the stakes were threatening to pierce holes in the lining of her jacket. The garlic, regrettably, did not fit in her pockets, but perhaps it was better that way. All the better to make her move. Thea opened the door and stepped inside. Once again, the house had the feeling of being empty, and despite herself, Thea wondered if Alistair had gone out. But then she caught sight of him, lurking at the other end of the hall in the kitchen. "You're back early," he mused, and his eyes flashed dangerously like the blade of a concealed weapon. "Yes," said Thea, shutting the door behind her. She walked towards him, cunningly stowing the garlic in her fist. "There was a little errand I needed to run at home." Alistair arched one eyebrow in haughty suspicion, and then he smelled it. Thea caught the twitch of his countenance and took the cue to advance. She marched onwards, quickening her pace, and as she stormed into the kitchen, she raised her fist and brandished the garlic in the man's pallid face. Alistair recoiled, shrinking away from Thea and baring his teeth in a bestial snarl. Again his face contorted, his brow growing in molten folds, his eyes darkening. His whole facade grew stormy, and adrenaline pounded through Thea's veins. "So, you see me for what I am," said Alistair, his voice suddenly thicker, and transfixed on his hideous unmasked form, Thea could see why. Twin blades protruded from his mouth like the maw of a saber-toothed tiger. His lips had drawn thinner around his teeth and purpled like an aging bruise. Sallow was his skin and taut across the arching cheekbones. Black were the vampire's eyes. "Don't you find it alluring?" he purred, and Thea's eyes widened. "Alluring?" she stammered. "Yes, alluring," he continued, and Thea could swear that he was growing taller. "The promise of eternal being, never aging, never greying or fading away." His smile widened into a jack-o'-lantern grin. "You could be young forever," he rasped. Thea struggled for words. Somehow she hadn't quite believed her own instincts, and now, seeing them come to life before her, had knocked the breath right out of her chest. Alistair lurched towards her, and still she held the garlic, brandishing it before her. "Imagine it," purred Alistair in that thick, salivating drawl. He was too close now, uncomfortably close. She could smell his rancid breath permeating through her. "We could be great, you know, you and I, in the ancient halls of darkness, whiling the centuries away." Sweat beaded on Thea's brow. She was still thrusting the garlic towards him. He was almost touching it now, but to no avail. He would be bearing down upon her any second. "Will you join me, Thea?" he growled. "Become my lady of darkness." One clammy talon reached out and clutched at Thea's hand. She shuddered at his touch. And shocked into action, she reached into her jacket pocket and grasped a wooden stake. Dropping the garlic, she lunged at him, slicing through the air before him and driving the stake ever closer. The vampire held her wrist in that sickening grip. His strength was immeasurable. He tossed her aside like a rag doll and retreated into the kitchen. "Oh, Thea," he purred, physically salivating, his parched lips no longer holding back the strings of stinking drool. "You disappoint me." Alistair lunged forward, gripping Thea by the throat and slamming her to the ground, hard. His tendon claw squeezed on her wrist until she was forced to drop the steak. It rolled dully away from her across the polished floor. His deathly scent was almost suffocating as he held her down, inching closer and closer. "It's a pity," he murmured, so close to her neck that it set her hackles on end. "You could have joined me. But it's no matter. Draining you will be just as satisfying." His lips drew back into a final snarl as he prepared to strike. He writhed like a cobra, savouring the moment, calculating the juiciest place to pierce the skin. So strong was his bloodlust that he failed to notice Thea reaching down to the waistband of her jeans. She grasped the pewter crucifix, and gritting her teeth, she thrust it forwards into the vampire's face. It worked. Alistair cowered away, shrinking back across the floor, his snarl contorting into one of terror. Thea scrambled to her feet and surged forwards, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She pushed the crucifix deftly onwards, and with each step, Alistair shrank lower, as if he was trying to sink into the polished tiles. And pulling another stake from her jacket pocket, she fell upon him, sinking the wood into his cold, dead heart. His scream was a stentorious flash frost ripping through Thea's very being. His crumbling form caved, leaving nothing but dust and a silence that rang in the young woman's ears. Thea sat on the floor for quite some time, still gripping the crucifix in a tightly trembling fist. A familiar sound shook her from her stupor. The keys in the lock. Angela was home. The door swung open at Angela's touch, and Thea was racked with relief at the sight of her mother. Angela stepped into the hallway and knew something was amiss. Her eyes darkened, and her skin crawled as she caught the waft of garlic.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's grisly tale. Please join us next time for another adventure into the dark unknown.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fireside, written by Rodeo Whiter and Dan Lee, and produced by RODEAX.